In the spring of 1983, a building on a flat plain in the middle of Long Island held the most successful team in North American professional sports. 4 consecutive Stanley Cup championships, 19 consecutive playoff series won, a record no team in any major league has touched since. The players called other rinks arenas. They called this one the Barn, and the Barn had a second name, earned the hard way, Fort Neverlos. 38 years later, on a June night in 2021, the last thing anyone ever threw onto that ice in celebration was a shoe. The building cost $32 million to raise. It cost $180 million to renovate. And the fortune that was finally supposed to save it, a casino promised at $4 billion, then $6 billion, walked away in a press release before a single shovel touched the ground. The team that won everything inside those walls left the building twice, came back once, and left for good. The Dynasty is still honored, still banner hung. The arena that made it is a county-owned question mark on a former runway, home to minor league tenants and an argument nobody has won. The distance between Fort Neverlos and a building nobody would pay to keep is the story of a place that produced one of the great empires in sports and could not produce a reason for its own survival. It begins, like most things on this particular ground, with airplanes. Chapter 1. The Flat Ground. Before the arena, there were runways. The center of Nassau County is a plain, the Hempstead Plains, flat and treeless in a region that is neither, and flat, treeless ground is what the first generation of American aviation needed more than it needed anything else. The plain became airfields. The airfields became Mitchell Field, an Army installation, and later an Air Force base. 1,200 acres of hangars and barracks and concrete in the middle of the most crowded suburb in the United States. The base was decommissioned in 1960. The county acquired most of the ground in 1961, and for a decade, the flattest, best-connected land on Long Island sat waiting for someone to decide what a suburb was supposed to do with a dead airfield. The answer broke ground on January 20, 1969, a Coliseum. 63 acres of the old base, a concrete bowl designed by Welton Beckett and Associates, 32 U-shaped columns holding up the roof, a price of $32 million in county money. The name was not sold to a bank or an airline. It was given away, deliberately, to the men who had trained and shipped out from the ground it stood on. Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, a building on a military grave named for the buried. It opened on February 11, 1972, and the first event was not hockey, it was basketball, an American Basketball Association game in which the home team, the New York Nets, beat the Pittsburgh Condors by the record of the night, 114-107. The Nets were the tenant of the building's first hour. They would be the first thing it lost. The second tenant arrived because the county said no. A rival hockey league, the WHA, had a team ready to move in. Nassau's officials did not consider it a real league and wanted nothing to do with it. The NHL, given roughly 6 months to conjure a franchise that would lock the upstart out of the county's new building, conjured one. They called it the Islanders. On October 7, 1972, the expansion Atlanta Flames came to Uniondale for the first hockey game the Coliseum ever held. Keep that opponent in mind. The Flames come back at the very end of this story, 49 years later, in a different building, and their return closes a circle nobody planned to draw. For now, in 1972, the arithmetic looked simple. 1 new building, 2 new teams, a county of commuters with money and nowhere local to spend a winter evening. What nobody could see was that a line had already been drawn around the building, not on the ground, but on a map in a league office, and the line had a price. Chapter 2. The Circle on the Map. Roy Boe had made his money in sportswear before he made his problems in sports. By the early 1970s, he owned both of the Coliseum's tenants, the Nets outright, and a founding stake in the Islanders, which meant that for a brief window, one man in a Connecticut office held every professional game the building would host. What he also held, in Julius Erving, was the most electrifying basketball player alive. Erving, Dr. J, a Long Island kid from Roosevelt, a few minutes' drive from the arena, carried the Nets to ABA championships in 1974 and 1976. Understand what that second title was. In the spring of 1976, the ABA was visibly dying, down to a handful of solvent franchises, its merger talks with the NBA already effectively a surrender, and the Nets beat Denver in 6 games to win the championship everyone understood would be the league's last. The final ABA game ever played was played by this team, and the crowd cheered the closing night of an entire American league like a beginning, because from the floor it looked like one. And then the league died underneath them, and the terms of its death were written by other people. The ABA and NBA merged in August of 1976, and the merger was less an invitation than a toll. Each surviving ABA team owed $3.2 million just to walk through the door. But the NBA's rules gave every existing franchise a protected territory, a circle 75 miles across drawn around its arena, and the circle around Madison Square Garden had covered the ground under Nassau Coliseum since before the Coliseum existed. The Knicks demanded $4.8 million for the invasion of a territory the Nets had been playing in for years. Boe offered them Julius Erving himself, the best player in the sport, straight up, in exchange for waiving the fee. The Knicks refused. So, in October of 1976, needing millions he did not have by a deadline he could not move, Boe sold Erving to Philadelphia for $3 million. The greatest attraction in basketball never played an NBA minute in the building that had been his home floor. One season ticket holder, a man named Herb Crone, filed suit in Nassau County District Court for exactly $714. The price of the 2 seats he said he had bought on the promise that Dr. J would play at the Coliseum. Remember both of those numbers, $714 and $3 million. The distance between what a fan paid and what a fan was owed is the first honest measurement of what happened to this building. The Nets played one hollow NBA season on Long Island and left for New Jersey in 1977. Boe, wrung out, sold them in 1978. That same year, he sold his share of the Islanders. The building's first fortune had lasted 5 years and left in a contract envelope, undone not by anything that happened on its floor, but by a circle drawn in Manhattan. And here is the pivot the story turns on. The general manager Boe had hired for his hockey team stayed. The team Boe sold at the bottom was 2 years from the top. The man who had owned everything in the building walked away 12 months before the building became the center of the hockey world. Chapter 3. The Architect. Bill Torrey wore a bow tie every working day of his life, which made him look like an accountant, which was closer to the truth than the hockey world liked to admit. Hired in 1972 to build an expansion team from a blank ledger, Torrey did the one thing expansion executives almost never manage: nothing. He refused to trade his future for respectability. When the Islanders finished their first season among the worst teams the NHL had ever iced, Torrey held the first pick in the draft against every offer, including offers from Montreal's Sam Pollock, the most feared trader in the sport, and selected a teenage defenseman named Denis Potvin, compared to Bobby Orr since he was 14. Then Torrey hired Al Arbour, a former defenseman who had played the game in eyeglasses, to coach the roster into shape. What followed was construction, in the most literal sense the sport allows. Draft pick by draft pick, season by season. Clark Gillies, Brian Trottier, Mike Bossy, a scorer 11 teams passed on because they doubted his toughness, and who would score 50 goals a season for 9 straight years. Nearly every significant player on the roster that would win everything was grown inside the organization, a sentence that reads simply and describes something almost no franchise in any sport has pulled off. Twice the construction nearly broke. In 1978, the Islanders, favored, lost to Toronto. In 1979, they had the best record in the entire league and lost to the Rangers, the crosstown humiliation, the one loss the Coliseum's crowd could not metabolize. The demand everywhere was to tear the roster apart. Torrey and Arbour declined. The changes they made instead were small and precise. A defenseman named Ken Morrow, fresh from the Olympic team that had just beaten the Soviets, and a trade deadline center named Butch Goring, the missing depth Torrey had been hunting for years. 2 additions, no demolition. The patience of those 2 decisions is the entire dynasty in miniature, and in the spring of 1980, the bill for all of it came due at once, on the Coliseum's own ice, in sudden death. May 24, 1980, Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Final, Philadelphia at the Coliseum, tied after 3 periods. At 7 minutes 11 seconds of overtime, John Tonelli slid a pass across the crease, and Bob Nystrom, a grinder, not a star, an original Islander from the building's first season, tipped it home. The Coliseum had its first championship, won under its own roof, in the only way this building ever seemed to settle anything, suddenly. Hold on to that clock reading. 7 minutes, 11 seconds of overtime. The building will answer it 41 years later, almost to the breath. That night, at a poolside gathering, Torrey reportedly told his exhausted ice-packed players that 1 cup would not be enough, that now they would have to win 4 or 5 in a row. It sounded like a joke. It was a schedule. Minnesota fell in 1981. In 1981 to 82, the machine reached its full displacement. 54 wins, 118 points, Mike Bossy alone scoring 147, franchise records that still stand, and then, in the first round of those playoffs, the closest the Dynasty ever came to dying young. April 13, 1982, down 3-1 to Pittsburgh with under 6 minutes left in the deciding game, facing elimination on home ice. The Islanders scored twice and won the series in overtime. This building did not recognize any other form of verdict. Vancouver was swept in the final that followed. Edmonton, Gretzky's Oilers, the coming empire, was swept in 1983, held to 6 goals in 4 games by Billy Smith, hated in every rink but this one. 4 consecutive Stanley Cups, the first ever won by an American team. 16 players were on the roster for all 4. And when the run finally ended in the 1984 final, the ledger read 19 consecutive playoff series won, 1980 through 1984, a number that stands alone in the history of North American professional sports and is generally agreed to be unbreakable. The press needed a name for what visiting teams faced in Uniondale each spring and settled on the honest one, Fort Neverlos. Picture the Coliseum on a playoff night in May of 1983. The parking lots, the old runways repainted, fill from the Meadowbrook Parkway in a slow tide of headlights, and the tailgates open, because this crowd is suburban and drives to everything and has learned to make the asphalt part of the evening. Inside, the bowl is small by the league's standards and sounds larger than anything in it. 16,000 voices under a low concrete roof that gives every chant back with interest. The organ runs up its line and the building answers before the last note lands. Down on the ice, in warm-ups, skate the names that will hang from these rafters. Potvin, Trottier, Bossy, Smith in his crease like a landlord. Somewhere in the stands, a kid holds a hand-lettered sign taller than he is. The concourses smell of pretzels and spilled beer and the wet, cold breath of the ice plant. And out on the Hempstead Turnpike, the traffic has stopped in both directions, which is how the county knows it is a playoff night without turning on a radio. The visiting team skates its circles and does not look up, because looking up means reading the banners, and the banners are the point. A building 11 years old, on ground the Air Force abandoned, is at this hour the hardest place to win a hockey game on Earth. No one in the building that night is thinking about the roof, the plumbing, the ice plant, or the lease. Why would they? Empires do not inspect their own foundations. That is always someone else's job, later. Chapter 5. The Quiet After. Dynasties do not end with an announcement. They end with a 5-game loss in a final, which happened against Edmonton in 1984, and then with 1,000 small subtractions nobody marks at the time. Bossy's back gave out. Trottier aged. The draft picks stopped becoming Hall of Famers. The Islanders won their division in 1988 and then did not win it again. Not that decade, not the next. By the 1990s, the franchise had entered the wilderness that awaits every empire. Ownership turmoil, front office churn, seasons that ended in April with the building dark. By one accounting, the team went more than 2 decades between playoff series victories. Fort Neverlos became a fort that rarely had anything to defend. Through all of it, the Empire and the wilderness both, the building had been running a second business, and for long stretches, it was the better one. On the 100-odd nights a year without hockey, the barn was one of the great rock rooms in America. Elvis played it in the summer of 1973, and by one persistent local legend, it was on his tour schedule again when he died in 1977, a booking reported but never quite proven. The Grateful Dead treated the building like a residency. Pink Floyd came, and Genesis. In 1986, professional wrestling's second WrestleMania ran as a 3-city simulcast, and the Coliseum held the New York third of it. But no act belonged to the building the way Billy Joel did, a Hicksville kid playing the arena of his own county, recording under its roof, filling it as reliably as a home team. Keep him in mind, when this building needs someone to open its doors a second time, there will be exactly one correct name on the marquee. The concerts were, in their way, The barn's third fortune, the Nets behind it, the Islanders beside it, the music running underneath both. And like the other two, it depended on arithmetic the building did not control. Touring acts route themselves through the newest rooms with the largest grosses, and the region kept building newer rooms. The third fortune did not leave in a single season. It leaked date by date, and underneath the losing, quieter, and more patient, the building itself was becoming the problem. The Coliseum had opened in 1972 as a modern arena and had essentially stopped there. While the league around it built glass palaces with luxury suites and club levels and restaurant concourses, the revenue architecture that now decided which franchises were rich, the barn stayed a barn, low concrete, narrow halls, the smallest hockey capacity in the NHL, no meaningful luxury inventory to sell. What had been intimacy in 1980 was obsolescence by 2000. The same low roof that had made the crowd sound like weather now made the balance sheet impossible. By 2011, the decline had stopped being an atmosphere and become a repair list. The Islanders went to the county, which owned the building and always had, asking for roughly $4 million in fixes: the roof, sections of lower bowl seating, the ice plant itself. The machinery that made the ice the Dynasty had skated on was wearing out, and tenant and landlord were reduced to arguing over it like a family arguing about a furnace. The league's commissioner said publicly what everyone already understood: the Coliseum was no longer good enough for the NHL. Not unsafe, not condemned, just finished, the way a trade becomes unprofitable long before anyone closes the books on it. The building needed a savior with money, vision, and an almost irrational attachment to Long Island. In one of the darker jokes of this story, it got exactly that, and it was not enough. Chapter 6. The Lighthouse. Charles Wang arrived in Queens from Shanghai in 1952, 8 years old, one of 3 sons in a family that started over with very little. What he built from that start was Computer Associates, one of the first software giants, and a personal fortune large enough that in 2000 he could do something no sensible billionaire's advisor would recommend: buy the New York Islanders, a losing team in a dying building, largely because he lived there. Wang was not a hockey man. He was a Long Island man who had decided the island deserved better than a barn with a failing ice plant, and he proposed to fix it at the scale of a folly. The plan was called the Lighthouse Project, and it was not an arena renovation. It was a privately financed small city, a rebuilt Coliseum wrapped in towers, housing, offices, hotels, rising off the flat ground of the old airfield, with a lighthouse-shaped tower at its center. Wang would pay, the county would collect, the Islanders would stay for decades. For years, the renderings circulated and the hearings ground on, and the town of Hempstead, which controlled the zoning, squeezed the project down until the arithmetic died. The lighthouse was never voted down so much as weighted to death. The most common fate of grand plans on this ground was not rejection, it was paperwork. So Wang fell back, and the county fell back with him, to the smallest possible version of salvation, a public one. In 2011, County Executive Ed Mangano put a bond for $400 million before the voters, roughly $350 million for a new arena beside the old one, the balance for a minor league ballpark to be repaid, the officials promised, out of the revenue the project itself would generate. It was, everyone involved admitted, a last resort. The Islanders' lease ran out in 2015. There was no plan behind this plan. The vote was scheduled for August 1, 2011. A special election, midsummer, one question on the ballot: the future of a 40-year marriage between a team and its ground, put to a county that had its own arithmetic to do. Chapter 7. 57%. Consider what the average Nassau County homeowner was looking at in the summer of 2011. A property tax bill averaging around $11,500 a year, among the highest in the United States. A county government so deep in deficit that a state oversight board had declared a fiscal emergency and seized its finances months earlier. And now a ballot question asking that same county to borrow $400 million for a hockey arena on the promise offered without much in the way of published specifics that the building would pay for itself. August 1st came in hot, and in the afternoon it rained. Turnout was somewhere around 15%. A county of roughly 900,000 registered voters deciding the Coliseum's fate with fewer than 60,000 ballots. The count, when it settled, was 33,526 against and 24,553 for, 57% to 43. The margin was not cruel, it was simply a bill arriving at a house that could not pay it. The voters of Nassau County did not hate the islanders. They looked at their tax bills and at a government already in receivership and declined to co-sign. Wang stood before fans and employees at the Coliseum that night and gave the vote its epitaph in 6 words. "I'm disappointed. I'm heartbroken." Then he promised the team would honor its lease to the final season and left the stage. Within a year, the announcement everyone had braced for arrived. The Islanders would move to Brooklyn, to the Barclays Center, a basketball building inside the city, off the island, at the end of a train line their fans had spent 40 years not needing. There is a symmetry here worth sitting with. The building's first tenant, the Nets, had been forced off Long Island in 1977 by a circle on a league map and had ended up, after decades of wandering, in Brooklyn, at Barclays Center. Now the building's second tenant followed them to the exact same address. Both of the Coliseum's teams gone to the same building. Brooklyn collected them both without ever winning either. In the spring of 2015, the Islanders played what was billed as their final game at the Coliseum, won it, waved to the crowd, and left. The doors closed. And then this story did something rise and fall stories almost never do. It offered the building a second life, and the second life made everything worse. Chapter 8. The False Dawn. The Brooklyn years failed the way everyone outside the deal had predicted. Barclays Center had been designed for basketball. The hockey sightlines were compromised, the ice was notorious, sections of seats faced away from play, and the fan base, suburban, car-bound, generational, did not follow the team down the train line in the numbers the spreadsheets promised. Attendance sagged. Within 3 seasons, the franchise that had left Long Island because its building was inadequate was looking for a way out of the building it had left for. Meanwhile, the barn got its renovation after all, just not for hockey. The developer Bruce Ratner's group took over the county's building and spent 18 months and $180 million remaking it. New facade of aluminum fins meant to evoke the dunes and boardwalks of the island, new seating, new concourses, capacity trimmed rather than grown. It reopened on April 5, 2017, and the marquee carried the only name it could have carried, Billy Joel. The Hicksville kid who had helped make the barn a rock room in its first life opened its second one, exactly as promised. Read the arithmetic of that renovation twice. $32 million to build the entire Coliseum in 1972. $180 million to refurbish it 45 years later, more than 5 times the original cost, for a building that emerged from the work still too small by the league's standards to permanently host the NHL. And yet the league came back anyway, because Brooklyn was worse. Beginning in 2018, the Islanders split, then fully shifted their home schedule back to the renovated Coliseum, a temporary arrangement, everyone stipulated, while the real answer rose from the ground at Belmont Park, UBS Arena, a purpose-built hockey palace on the Nassau-Queens border. The barn's second life was explicitly a hospice arrangement. The team had come home to say goodbye properly. Nobody expected the goodbye to be the best thing that had happened in the building in 38 years. In the pandemic spring of 2021, the Islanders went on a playoff run, through Pittsburgh, through Boston, that put the defending Stanley Cup champions Tampa Bay in the Coliseum for a semifinal. And on June 23, 2021, the building faced its final game with the home team 2 goals down and 1 loss from the end. Chapter 9. 68 seconds. Midway through the second period of Game 6, the Lightning led 2-0, and the arithmetic in the building was funeral arithmetic. The defending champions had scored 12 unanswered goals in the series. The Islanders' season was 40 minutes from over, and the Coliseum's life as a major league arena would end with it. Then Jordan Eberle scored before the second intermission. Then, in the third, a defenseman named Scott Mayfield, not a star, in the oldest tradition of this franchise, tied it. And the last NHL game the barn would ever hold went where the barn's biggest games had always gone, to sudden death. It lasted 68 seconds. Anthony Beauvillier picked off a pass at the top of the right circle, gathered the puck, and beat the best goaltender in the world with the first shot of overtime. 1 minute, 8 seconds. The building that had opened its championship history at 7-11 of overtime in 1980 closed its major league history at 1:08 of overtime in 2021. 2 grinders' names, Nystrom and Beauvillier, bolted to either end of a 41-year span, both goals scored on the same ice, into the same sudden silence, followed by the same detonation of sound. Except this detonation had weight. The crowd threw what it had. Beer cans arced out of the stands and burst on the ice. Bottles followed. At least one pair of shoes came down out of the upper bowl, the detail the record keeps because it explains everything. A fan so far past calculation that footwear seemed like a reasonable offering. The players skated through the debris, grinning. Matthew Barzal, asked afterward about the barrage, gave the night its plainest review. "I've never seen anything like that." By one accounting, no NHL team had ever won the final game in a closing building, in the third round of the playoffs, in overtime. The barn had waited 49 years and saved its strangest statistic for last. 2 days later, the Islanders lost Game 7 in Tampa, and the season and the building ended in the same breath. There was no demolition, there was no ceremony, there was a Zamboni, and then a summer, and then the trucks that carried the banners, 4 Stanley Cups, the retired numbers, the Dynasty entire, west along the parkways to Belmont. The history left, the building stayed, which is precisely backwards from how these stories usually run, and precisely the point of this one. Chapter 10. The Ground Waits. UBS Arena opened in November of 2021, and the Islanders' first home opponent there, on November 20th, was the Calgary Flames, the same franchise that had skated into the Coliseum for its first hockey game in October of 1972. Nobody at the league office claims to have planned it. The schedule simply closed the circle on its own, the Flames at one end of the barn's life, the Flames at the beginning of its replacements. The history moved 8 miles down the road and hung itself from newer steel. What remained in Uniondale was a freshly renovated, structurally sound, essentially purposeless building. Minor league tenants moved through it. Concerts came intermittently, and around it, the county resumed the only activity this ground has reliably produced since the Air Force left: planning. In 2023, the county legislature approved a 42-year lease of the site to Las Vegas Sands, which proposed to answer the Coliseum question forever with a casino resort priced in the billions, $4 billion by some accounts, $6 billion by others. It would have been the largest private investment in the county's history. It was fought immediately by Hofstra University across the turnpike, by a civic association named with the plainest possible words, "Say no to the casino," by a village lawsuit over the environmental review. And then it did not lose the fight, it left it. On April 23, 2025, Sands announced it would not bid for a New York casino license at all, citing the threat of online gambling and concluding that the best use of its billions was buying back its own stock. The fourth fortune withdrew by press release. The county's leadership insisted other bidders were interested, that the site remained what officials had called it for a generation, the most valuable undeveloped parcel in the county, a phrase that had outlasted every plan attached to it. 8 months later, in December of 2025, New York State awarded its 3 downstate casino licenses to a project in the Bronx and 2 in Queens. Nothing for Nassau. The prize the county had spent years clearing its most valuable ground to win was divided, in the end, among other people's ground by a board in Albany. Every fatal decision in this building's life was made somewhere else: the territorial circle drawn in a league office, the arena standards set at NHL headquarters, the bond defeated at polls with 15% turnout, the license granted to other boroughs. The Coliseum never once lost at home. It only ever lost in rooms it was not in. So stand in the parking lot on a summer evening in 2026 and take the inventory. The building is 54 years old and wears a 9-year-old facade of aluminum fins meant to look like beach dunes. Inside, the concourses are clean and mostly quiet. 8 miles west in Elmont, the 4 Stanley Cup banners hang above sellout crowds, and children who will never set foot in Uniondale learn the numbers: 19 straight series, 4 straight cups, as facts about a team, not about a place. Herb Krohn's $714 lawsuit and Roy Boe's $3 million heartbreak are footnotes. Nystrom's 7 minutes 11 seconds and Beauvillier's 1 minute 8 seconds are highlights that play in another building. And under all of it, indifferent to all of it, is the flat ground. The Hempstead Plains received the biplanes, and then the bombers, and then the barracks. It received a concrete bowl and 20,000 cars a night and the loudest springs in the history of hockey. It was promised a lighthouse and did not get one, promised a casino and did not get one, and it registers neither promise. The runways became parking lots, and the parking lots are still there, striped and patient, holding whatever the county decides to set on them next. The Dynasty outlived its arena. The arena, so far, has outlived every plan to replace it. The ground has outlasted them both, the way it outlasted the Air Force, without effort and without opinion. It is flat. It is empty at the edges. It is waiting, the way it has always waited, for the next thing to land.